open source models, I think, there are almost no good use cases for those that will survive in the long term. Not because they're open source, but because it's better to have a big company around them that helps make them really good.
Welcome to Season 2 of Building with AI, the show where we engage in conversations with world-class AI product builders and leaders. We help uncover tactical insights to help you build and scale better AI products. I'm your host, Haroon Choudery, and today we're joined by Otto von Zastrow-Marcks, the founder of Midpage, platform for revolutionizing legal research. In this episode, Otto shares his unique journey, which began with robots and landed him in the world of legal tech. He explores the retrieval challenges that Midpage encountered and reveals their two-step approach to overcoming them. Additionally, Otto dives into the transformative impact of Gen AI on legal user interface, speculates on the future of legal tech, and much more. But before we get started, here's a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Autoblocks, the AI optimization platform product teams use to create world-class AI experiences. So, you just launched V0 of your AI feature or product. What's next? Autoblocks unlocks an intuitive yet powerful optimization workflow that helps you continuously understand, improve, differentiate your AI-powered products. Understand how your users interact with your product by connecting user activity to what's happening under the hood of your application. Improve your product thoughtfully and iteratively. Integrate testing of your AI products into your CI workflow and run A/B tests to see what changes are driving great user outcomes. Differentiate your AI products with powerful fine-tuning workflow that lets you turn product usage data into training data. Get started with Autoblocks for free at autoblocks.ai. Now, back to the episode. Otto, welcome to the show.
Hey, Haroon, nice to meet you.
Likewise. So for those who aren't familiar with Midpage and who you are, do you mind giving a quick intro on yourself and what you're working on?
Sure. So I'm a computer scientist. I started my first company more in the robotics scene. And then back then we were building outdoor robots and tried to put cameras on top of them to make them drive like autonomous cars, but they were actually lawn robots. At the time, still relying on underground perimeter-wise. So it was a very different problem, but it was very focused on computer vision and making models run efficiently on board. But after a while, it turned out that bringing consumer products to market that involve fast rotating blades is quite difficult. And eventually, we just stopped working on that, went back to ETH. I was working on language models when I started to get interested in how legal tech works, because many of my friends were lawyers. They all were complaining about how horrible their first jobs were when they were transitioning from law school into those. And so I just started talking to a bunch of lawyers until I decided that's where I want to focus on. And Midpage was then started a year ago. We help lawyers, especially US lawyers, that are working on cases. And those people spend all day doing research and drafting cases. And we have a generative AI platform to help them do that much more effectively.
Got it. So you essentially moved from lawns to law. So you took the N out. What specifically about the law space appealed to you in regards to that's where you decided to start a business in?
I had friends complaining about the problem. I knew it was urgent and I thought it was a good fit to my personal skills. But then, of course, the longer answer that I find more interesting is we all know that language models or foundation models are going to change knowledge work in a very dramatic way because it's only text in, text out. Nobody has more text than lawyers. They spend all their day just reading text and writing text. And especially litigation, that's the whole task works within that sphere. And I think with every new foundation model that comes out, some of the more horizontal infrastructure companies will have a hard time capturing the market and building useful products that are still useful next year. But if you look at a vertical domain where it's always about answering little questions, and the whole task can be solved with language models actually, but somebody is going to build on top of these foundation models to just adapt it to make it more specific for the lawyers. I think that's a very long-term model, and I think it's going to have a huge impact. There's no limit to how far it can go. Eventually, we'll be answering all our legal questions directly with some JTBD-like interface while you're at the company. But until then, we are helping lawyers to answer questions, spending way less time on them than they are doing now.
So for somebody who's not super familiar with the legal space, can you describe in very simple terms Who exactly are you targeting? When you say lawyers, are you specifically targeting like paralegals or otherwise? And what jobs to be done are you specifically focused on?
Litigators are those that work on cases. You have some problem, you want to build a house, but the neighbors are suing because they don't like the idea of it. And then somebody comes in and has to do a bunch of research across past cases to figure out what are the rules of what we are allowed to do. And then they usually write down a long document with an answer that could either be sent to the court or to the other side. And so they spend most of their day reading through precedents and then writing down the results. And that is the task that we're solving. And this is, any other kind of lawyer that is not a litigator. If you're working on contracts, you sometimes have to look up rules. But our main focus group is US litigators.
I see. And you mentioned that there's a lot of documentation that's good fodder for generative AI. What was the early venture into Midpage and what did it look like? And what was the discovery that you were able to save litigators a lot of time using this technology because they had a lot of documentation and because of the unique advantages that generative AI lends to?
Every year in the US, there are around 300 million cases, which is a massive number. And they're often very long documents. And that is mostly public data. Every case that goes to the court, or many of those eventually become public. And so when a lawyer does research, even today, they do research across this public database. And they have old existing today case libraries that they use. Maybe their search is not the most amazing, but essentially they're looking for something and it feels like Google where you get a page as a result. As soon as you do really simple things like in a search, helping them to understand what the case is about before they open it up and how it connects to the project you're working on in general, that has like a huge wow effect. And so that was the first moment where we knew we were onto something.
What was the MVP for Midpage? What exactly did it look like?
So the first version is actually a bit different to what we're doing now. We started off wanting to do was a pure GitHub Copilot for lawyers, where we were thinking about, okay, they're writing in Word all the time. So let's build an auto-completion that helps them, get in the knowledge from their research and just help them write the next few lines. And of course, I was a big fan of GitHub Copilot. I was using it all the time to write code. And I love how it is very proactive, how you'll get suggestions even without having asked it. So you can use GitHub Copilot even if you don't know what it is or where it came from. And we had all this public data available, so we knew sort of there's no boundaries in that sense. But what we found out very soon was the problem is too broad. With coding, as long as you have a good understanding of how code works, having just a few files that are locally and describe the program you're writing is enough context to make helpful suggestion. But for lawyers, that doesn't work that way. They really need to manually spend a lot of time searching through, understanding, and approving different cases before they want them to be included into their auto-completion. So an auto-completion is possible, but you have to do the research first. So we have to move further upstream and build a whole research platform before we can do the drafting. And now what we're doing is the whole end-to-end flow, not just this one piece. But we're still very much believing in the idea of having insertion points directly in Word and being proactive so that you get suggestions without having to trigger it manually.
Okay, so you mentioned that there's I guess you could call it a sifting mechanism that's important for building a copilot. How do you facilitate that with Midpage today to make sure that only the relevant documents are being taken into account?
It's a good question. And first of all, as an analogy, it's a bit similar to how researchers would research through archive. There are a lot of papers out there, and you start reading a bunch of them until you find the really important ones. And just the problem is with lawyers, the number of cases is 100 times higher, and also the throughput, the cases that they look at in a given day is also probably 10 times higher. And the cases are 10 times longer. And so the first step is you'll be searching for something, and we built a search that understands the whole backend of your case, because you can give it some context, you can upload some documents or describe your case. And this means that the search results already are much better than just what you get from a bunch of keywords. And that was really fun because you can't use off-the-shelf solutions. We can get into that later. But then the second step is, after showing some useful cases, we really want to have many tools that the lawyer can guide to see more about this case to quickly decide, is it relevant to look into detail into this case, or should I skip this one? And because all of those pages are really dense legal language, it's important to make it easy for them. So we can show them, hey, the outcome of this case is not useful for you. It actually supports the other side that you're arguing for. Or we show a fact comparison where we look at all the key facts in the new case and compare them to your own description that you gave. And then we highlight some of the key similarities and differences. And then you can also see the extras and jump directly into those. So that part is more of a getting the UI right, because of course it's much of OpenAI GPT-4 prompting with a layer of fact checking and stuff like that. And so this way you sort of help them narrow down which cases they look at. And then when they open up the first few cases, within the case itself, of course, also a bunch of moments where we can help. They will be taking a lot of notes. And what the note looks like today is that you just highlight sections that you like. And then later when drafting, you basically just want to copy together a list of sections that you found that all support the same argument. And so we still want to use humans to select which parts are good enough, but we can use language models to then group them by argument and organize all this information. So a lot of the work goes into building up a automatic collection of your research, which you can control and refine, but the language models help you do the note taking, whereas you focus on the reading of the case. And then once you've done all that, only then you start getting ready to do the drafting. But the cool thing is that part, drafting, is then really, really easy because you just want to combine the things that you found earlier. And then, of course, you can use language models to look through those drafts that you have, those snippets that you selected, and say, oh, give me everything related to this topic, and write a short paragraph combining those.
So when you're coming up with some of these like UI, UX considerations, how are you iterating on this? Are you seeking feedback from professionals in the space who are using the tool? Are you basing it on the intuition and domain expertise that you have and what you would find to be most intuitive? I'm curious, like, what the process is of potentially working with design partners on iterating on the right UI, UX.
Yeah, I mean, this is a SaaS product, so the UI is super important. And lawyers are not experts at using software, so it has to be really simple. Well, in our team, next to a bunch of really amazing engineers, we have James, who has a software undergrad degree, but he then went to law school, worked at one of sort of New York's very big law firms. And he's now our sort of product manager. And he's, of course, like the first wave. He's designing lots of the UI in Figma. And so from there, it's more typical how you'd imagine that we sometimes come up with product ideas, make little sketches, and then sometimes with the help of a designer, sometimes without, just test them with users or just with James. And yeah, and then our users are mostly small practices. So in the US, there are around 1.3 million lawyers. Of those, 65% are in very small law firms with less than 6 lawyers. And so many of those are like countryside and working on smaller things. Those are involve much more early adopters. And unlike in the very big firms, they can just, if they like something, they can just start using it. They have much less constraints, and that's the best group of users to focus on at the beginning. It means that we don't have one big design partner, but we had a bunch of excited early adopters that were previously using JTBD, but that noticed is really not good at that. And then so they sometimes give us feedback just via the intercom channel that we have, where we jump on calls with them.
I see. And I'm curious to dig into the specifics as to how you facilitate the better research, organizing, and drafting of this documentation. What's your tech stack look like? How exactly are you making the generative AI model work for your particular use case?
Of course, as a SaaS app, we have the whole standard things like it's a Next.js app. And then, because I guess the interesting part of the tech stack is the AI part. Now, we don't train our own models. All of us have a deep learning background. So at the beginning, we thought that's all we'd be doing. But we quickly found out that's the wrong place to spend effort. Fine-tuning via the API is a much better way to do it. It's cheaper, it's more robust. You can use the intelligence. I think something that I am betting on, not on the open source models, but on the sort of foundation models by larger companies. I guess every people have their own opinion on that. I have a difficult to answer legal question, or if you want a summary of some text, and you can fit all the text itself in the context of the model. Fine-tuning a open source model to produce good sounding summaries produces much less reliable results than taking a more intelligent model capable of really understanding the text better and then produces a summary that might not always sound right, but is much more based on the actual information there. So that's why we use GPT-4. And then on the rest of the things that you need, we have tools like Prompt Layer to help us manage prompt and collect some that didn't work well. It's a great tool to help our domain experts iterate on the prompt while it's already integrated in the app. And we're also going to look into some other things more for metrics based on how many users are spending which amount of our dollars on which prompt and so on. And then, of course, on the search side, that's the last part where we actually built a lot of our own stuff. Because if you have a database of 30 million documents that are all 40 pages long, you can try to use just an off-the-shelf vector database. And we are collaborating with Pinecone on sort of in an early adopter alpha program there. But it's not enough. We have to go some extra steps to really build something that works well for lawyers.
Got it. Yeah, I'm curious to dig into the retrieval aspect in a little bit more detail, because I imagine that's challenging given that you're working with so much documentation and trying to surface the right documentation to your users for a more streamlined experience. What are some of the challenges that you have faced in making this retrieval work in the most efficient way possible?
We use something like retrieval at many different stages throughout the product, so it's always different which task you're talking about. But if it's about the main task, which is the search for cases, there the problem is that vector databases are very good at finding passages. But if you just search for one thing, it might be, you're searching for a case about a copyright infringement issue where the settlement fee was, lower than some certain amount. Those two things might be in a different passage of the same document. And so just a passage search is not going to be very effective. And this is what the standard embedding search with all the vector databases was built for. And of course, you can try and compute embeddings over a larger piece of text, or you could try to, let's just use 10 embeddings to cover different sections of the whole document and then do it that way. But even there, then the results are no longer specific enough because the passages sometimes are important. And so what we built is more like a two-stage approach, which first tries to find good documents where we're using some background of the lawyer's case that they gave us and finding ones where really the outcome is right and where document level similarity is high between that and the case of the user. And then we try and find the right passages, and then we do some re-ranking.
Okay, so how are you measuring the effectiveness of some of these techniques? One from a RAG perspective, and then also from the perspective of the prompts that you're feeding in, and maybe any other parameters that are feeding into the ultimate experience for your users. What are the things that you're keeping track of, and how do you know whether you're moving towards the right direction or the wrong direction?
So with lawyers, of course, you have to be very careful and to only track things that you think are very safe to track, where the lawyers wouldn't have any problem with that. And so sometimes that means anonymized data, and sometimes that means no data at all. But there's still many useful things. When building our search, it was very important to have a good metric that says, wow, we changed the search system, so did it get better or not? And of course, we can look at past searches from those users that want to share that data, and then just use that as a test bed. But the much more effective way to do that has been to actually come up with a bunch of our own search queries. We used GPT-4 to help with that, but that was a more manual thing. And then automatically evaluate the quality of the search results with GPT-4. That was a very good proxy metric. And you shouldn't rely only on that, but that gives you a lot of insight because the search results are different every time. Having ground truth is very hard, because if you change the search system, suddenly you might get 100 different results. And now you could use ground truth to preserve the ranking between different results, but you can't use ground truth to really explain, oh, this one is really good for that search term. And so we just built an automatic evaluation system and sometimes check that manually, split the queries into different groups to get like a more granular perspective on what's working and what's not. And that's, I think, an approach that people will be using much more in the future. In the old days, it was like data is the new oil. If you have a lot of users doing searches and you can use that to improve your product, this is now much less an advantage because you can just come up with a new product, maybe with some user data, but you don't really need that because you can synthesize it.
Okay, great. And so you mentioned that having a base model like GPT-4 is more powerful than fine-tuning a model to speak in a specific type of tone or style, at least in your use case. What are some of the other findings that you've had while tweaking the different parts of your product that you found to drive a difference in the end experience?
I found really interesting is how language models are like a new foundational technology. And now we have to make a lot of new discoveries on how good user interfaces look like. And chat has obviously become very popular, but there are many other things as well. And it's hard to see how it's going to evolve over the long term. We had several design decisions where we noticed, okay, this is like a unique UI problem. We have to figure out an intuitive solution for it. And that's really fun because you really get creative, and then you hope you're so proud about your idea that maybe some others will copy this over time. What I think is going to become very common is that you have text that is no longer just text, but is very interactive. You can read through a long document and you'll automatically get highlights for the things that you should be looking at. And it is grouped into tags. And so even when you open it, you can like jump to those tags. And it's important to like find a good balance between what is like the amount of information you want to see. How do you filter that by stuff that is actually useful and not just anything? And of course, we can also collapse some sections of the text and make them expandable so that you're no longer just looking at a wall of text, but you're looking at a more structured view. We're also having an auto-generated table of contents in there. And those are many different small things that are all easy to build by themselves. And it's a lot of fun to get them up to a high quality. And there's a lot of things that we can do there. And what I found really interesting is that then each of those small things, because we have the background of which case the user is currently working on, they're all automatic. You don't have to type in any extra information. It's all learning. Each task is learning from the other tasks and the other user interactions that the user has done on the platform. So we know what things you were searching for in the past. So we can actually highlight, and we even know which things you marked as this is extra important. So we can auto highlight that similar section in the next case you open. So it's sort of finding lots of synergies across different tasks and across reading. And that is a really interesting way of looking at text that I think will propagate to other industries as well. And then, hey, maybe this is the first time that legal tech, which has not always been the most sexy thing on the world, is going to have some ideas before other industries have them. And so people will be copying ideas over, which would be great.
Yeah, I could see there being applications for that in the consumer, like reading app industries as well. I'm a heavy user of Readwise's Reader app, and I could definitely see lightweight version of those features being useful in something like that. And I think your point on UI being very important and UI and UX being very important is prescient, because that's one of the reasons why a lot of incumbents are afraid of AI native startups just grabbing a lot of the market share, is because they'll fundamentally reinvent how users are able to get from point A to point B using generative AI and reinvent the experience, make it much more pleasant, much more intuitive. Do you see that as being a competitive advantage versus any incumbents, if there are any incumbents in your industry, against them as you continue to progress?
Interesting question. Yeah, there are definitely incumbents in legal tech. That a lot of them are just case libraries that are very established, and everybody's been using those for decades. Those are all aware of Gen AI as like a big thing, and so they're all building entirely new products because sometimes quicker to do that than to integrate AI into your old products. And it kind of draws on the same conclusion of, because the ideal UI is now so different, it's not really that you need the deepest understanding, the very best AI engineers, but you do need to rethink the whole product. Not only embed all the AI at different features, but also rethink what could the ideal product be, because we're finding all these synergies between the different tasks. So it no longer makes sense to only have a platform to read cases that doesn't take care of all the note-taking and the drafting because of all these synergies. And yeah, and of course, this means that building a new product from scratch, this is something that startups are very good at. And also, if the old data advantage becomes much less of a reason, much less of a moat, because we can synthesize some of that data. And in our case, we also think that's definitely true. The question, of course, is then, how do we build a moat going forward?
Yep. And how do you see that? What are the things that will give startups like yours an edge as you progress?
While reading, we automatically build up this research collection about the case that you're currently working on. This already becomes like a notion, like a repository for the research that you're doing. And lawyers often revisit their past work because they build on top of that or they share it with their colleagues. And so it actually has a lot of stickiness in that sense. Like any repository of your own work is always going to be something that is valuable. And this is a different kind of data, right? Because previously the platform was only looking at searches, and often the user wasn't even logged in. But if they get just individual search data, they don't know all the things about what the case was about. They just know that part. And now we have like a much more holistic way where we can like even suggest while you're in Word things that you should be doing because we know what you are researching on.
As you were building up Midpage, what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced, especially when working with non-deterministic code?
Yeah, that's definitely a small challenge that this used to work, but no longer does. When some model was updated and then the output doesn't get parsed correctly anymore or something like that. I think it's important to have a more fuzzy testing approach in terms of, you automatically, you always look at some of the outputs that your users were shown, and, prompt layer is a good tool to look at all the prompts that were running through your developer environment or your alpha environment, and then make sure that you can mark those that are suspicious or just look at some of them manually. And in the future, I think there'll be much better, more matured tool environment where we can even automatically flag things that sound suspicious, where right now that is manual. But other challenges, I mean, of course, initially there was a lot around, oh, these models are so slow, latency is an issue. There's also, it doesn't quite feel right to spend a lot of time prompting around. And we still do a little bit of that. It's gotten better with newer models and more experience and better tools. But I think that problem will disappear over time, just as the foundation models and the sort of whole infrastructure layer around them gets better at doing it. Because we all know that you can give a model 10 examples of what to do in the context, and that was great. Now we have API fine-tuning, so we can do even more than that. And in the future, what I'm looking forward to is when you don't even have to select which model. You don't even have to select, okay, this requires this amount of intelligence. But instead, I just want one API where I can send the question. And if that is some lower intelligence model that is cheaper to run and faster, it can decide after producing an answer, is that answer, does it convince me or not? If not, maybe it goes to the more intelligent model. That whole process of using these things should be much more intuitive. And that's not something that we should consider our core expertise. Those things are changing quite fast. So the real challenge is how can you build a UI when the whole underlying machine is like changing really, really fast?
So looking ahead, how do you see this industry moving, and where exactly does Midpage fit into it?
So right now we're focusing on helping lawyers, helping the experts, because these tasks that we talked about, finding precedents and so on, there are some non-lawyers that do it as well, but lawyers do this 100 times more. So that's where the task is the most repetitive, where there's the most groundwork that we can help with, and where the problem is the most urgent. And in the future, and then this will really enable smaller teams to do the same as bigger teams. It will enable them to get much more accurate at what they do. And it will also ensure that maybe if some court case today takes many months to get there, because every single step along the way takes a lot of time and a lot of money. In the future, lawyers are not the only ones that are answering legal questions. Often, some of our users are not lawyers, but they're involved in some lawsuit and they just want to figure out what's going on. And language models do really make it easier to understand some of the law, to understand what you're allowed to build and whatnot. And one of the far futures that I'm really interested in is if you're at a company and you're maybe releasing a product and you're not sure, about whether you're allowed to do this thing or whether those other products is too similar and there's copyright on it. In the future, I want a Midpage bot that is connected to my company bot. And this company bot knows all my Slack, it knows all my Notion, it knows exactly what our company is doing. And then I want to ask this legal bot, hey, do you think I'm allowed to do this? And it can help me get some initial answers. I might still involve the lawyers because I can't rely on those systems, but it might help me understand the first few steps in that question. And then the bots can exchange information. And that's the very far future. In the near-term future, we obviously have different things we're focusing on. But of course, with the foundation models advancing so rapidly, that far future can happen sooner than we think. And we already have a JTBD plugin. So in the future, I think what will happen is if I, as a user, type in any question into ChatGPT that requires a legal answer, maybe OpenAI will suggest, hey, I think you should use one of these legal tools to answer that question. So that will be like an interesting insertion point for many companies, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen. And what we're doing is we're building up this layer of extensions so that anywhere you interact with legal text, you will have these proactive suggestions of, hey, this case that you're looking at here, I can tell you 3 sections that are probably relevant for you because you've been reading these, interested in those sections for the past few hours. And we can also tell you that, oh, this text is a bit misleading because you found that section that they're referencing in the original document, and it actually says a bit of the opposite. And this is, some of the more repetitive work that lawyers do every day, where we're bringing this research collection of your own to all the places you interact with text. So in Word, in the browser, eventually in Outlook as well. So it's a bit like Grammarly. And that is going to take a few more months to build out.
And what are some of the field of Gen AI are you most excited to keep a pulse on in relation to the technologies that are being developed?
I mean, I have some background in language model research, but of course, I do still think that it's weird that we have the same amount of intelligence running at every token generation step. Instead, I want to model to reflect as long as it needs until it's understood the answer, and then use as little intelligence as needed or as little computation costs to just formulate the answer into words. And that is one of the many examples where we all know that language models are going to evolve to do that somehow, but it might take a long time. It might actually not make a huge difference. But that's one of the things I was always wondering about a few years ago. And the other example, as I mentioned automatically already, that we want some decision making between which model should answer the question. And then, of course, what we are doing is we're using embeddings and retrieval a lot. So I think there will be much better systems, much better service providers where we can send data to, and they will fine tune our re-ranker based on what we need. Or we will build our own system, which we're sort of looking into right now, where we have these millions of documents. They all cite each other, and they always have some text that explains why they're citing the other document. And so maybe if not in time, a sufficient amount of infrastructure is built by other companies, we will look into that ourselves. And I really don't think we're already at the limit of what we can use embedding models for.
Very interesting. And one thing I like to ask all guests on the show is, what is your hottest take that relates to Gen AI? Something that most people would disagree with.
Oh, the obvious one is that open source models, I think, there are almost no good use cases for those that will survive in the long term. Not because they're open source, but because it's better to have a big company around them that helps make them really good.
That is definitely a hot take, but not one that I haven't heard before. And I think would definitely agree with you there as well. Just to elaborate on that a little bit more, would you say there's any unique advantages to open source models that a better closed source model or a more powerful vetted closed source model wouldn't necessarily be able to compete with? Like maybe security, privacy. That's one of the things that comes up pretty often. Is that something that open source models will always be distinctly advantageous for?
I don't think so. Yes, you can of course argue, rightfully so, that they're good for the whole ecosystem because they make it much easier for everybody to build them and to understand and to participate in the research and so on. But security is really hard. You really want a company that has a lot of skin in the game when you want to rely on them for security products. I want it to be done by the best experts that are being paid a lot of money to do that. And maybe they decide that they have a good business model that is funding their research and their work. And maybe some of that output is actually open source just to give more transparency. But it's a for-profit company. It's a well-organized and coordinated team, which can work with large resources.
Otto, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you. It's really fun. Yeah, glad to meet you.